I'm going to just talk a little bit about how I came to writing about Tchaikovsky. Clearly, there's a lot of books written about him. A devastating amount has been written about Tchaikovsky, both in English, Russian, French, basically every language of the world. And one of the things I noticed in actually teaching his music is that my students at Princeton and other places just really adore Tchaikovsky's music without knowing anything really about his life or caring too much about it, in fact. And I have one student who is very happy to actually demonstrate a tattoo that she has on her arm. Um, and the one thing that I did notice, however, is that when this music was considered to them very, a source of joy and great beauty. I know that whenever I play Tchaikovsky in my house, my cat comes up because she loves these sounds. And clearly she doesn't know anything about Tchaikovsky's life. And the one thing I did notice is that this positivity and beauty and happiness that this music actually gives people doesn't really reconcile or square with the nature of writing about Tchaikovsky by people like me. Biographers tend to actually represent this composer as a rather melancholy type, romantic in the capital R sense of being sort of, effusive, suffering soul type of personality. And there is a lot of fairly tawdry speculation about the nature of his personal life and how that personal life might or might not have informed his compositions. I tend to believe that, art, which is a word that means artifice, fakeness, or, fiction, is distinct from artists. You create, we all create things in our lives which are not about ourselves. But in the 19th century, particularly, there was a move among a lot of artists in response to sort of more freer individualistic societies in Europe to express themselves. And in Tchaikovsky's case, that idea has been supercharged in the literature so that he is seen in all of his compositions, even those that you think cannot possibly have any relationship to his life, like the Nutcracker, as being somehow about his suffering soul or suffering self. And there are complicated reasons for this. One is that we tend to really, and I don't quite know why this is, but we tend to admire those artists who have seen to have gone through a great deal of ordeal to express themselves. And so to defy some sort of external circumstance, whether it's impoverishment or censorship or something else. There are all sorts of instances of this. We love Shostakovich because of the idea that how his music was secretly against Stalinism. We think of Beethoven as somebody who had all sorts of, physical encumbrances, deafness, and was a revolutionary in music during a revolutionary period. And that struggle and his defiance of aristocratic conventions is actually built into his compositions, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of this mapping of sort of the idea of struggle and defiance and overcoming and transcendence that's actually the story of a lot of great composers. Those composers who had pretty good lives, happy lives, like Joseph Haydn, or in the 20th century, Darius Milhaud, they are actually not as interesting to us. But Tchaikovsky is super interesting, and he's super beloved by my students, again, even though they don't really care too much to actually read these biographies. But he has been super romanticized, represented in the literature as this great suffering figure for a couple of reasons. One is he was 19th century Russian, as well as half 19th century Ukraine, because he spent a great deal of his career in Ukraine, where his beloved sister Alexandra lived. So he's an imperial figure. And what's clear from the literature is that he was homosexual, super gay, and that's manifest in all sorts of ways in different contexts within his correspondence and his diaries and his relationships with his family members, including his brother Modeste. His brother Modeste was a playwright as well as a libretto writer who was himself a gay man. And so Tchaikovsky, was part of within the aristocratic establishment in Russia, and in his personal family life, part of, a very rich and pretty happy, actually, homosexual community. That's not, however, how he's represented. He's represented as somebody who was burdened by his sexuality, suffered it greatly. And so there are stories in the literature about Tchaikovsky constantly feeling a sense of guilt and shame and perhaps doom. This is all going to come to a bad end because he has this sort of secret life. And then there is this story that's trafficked still in program notes that somehow his final symphony, the Pathétique Symphony, is somehow a kind of suicide note. And that, in fact, that he did commit suicide. Um, Whereas we now know, based on a huge number of documents, including medical reports and testimonies, that he died during one of the annual cholera epidemics that hit St. Petersburg. Cholera was something that particularly in the fall and the autumn, was, a disease and illness that actually came up through the waterways from the south and got into the pipes of St. Petersburg. And in the year that Tchaikovsky died, there was a very bad rate of infection for this, and a lot of members of the aristocracy came down with it, including, obviously, the 19th century Russia's greatest composer. So we can talk all about that a little bit later on. But I just want to, first of all, just talk about um, what I know of him from writing a book about him, which was a book that I wrote because he made my students so happy, and that happiness I could not reconcile with the misery that's represented in the literature. So what I thought I would do today with you is actually talk through first few of his most famous pieces and play you some stuff, and then talk about the stories behind those works to sort of make them different to you. And then at the end, we can have a conversation about everything that I'm putting on the table here. First of all, though, I just want to play you this clip from a movie that came out a couple of years ago. It's actually an amazing movie. It's called Tchaikovsky's Wife, Zhena Tchaikovskova. And it was filmed by Kirill Serebrennikov, who is a provocative maverick theater director who used to work at the Gogol Center in Moscow before being kicked out of there by the Putin regime. And he made this movie which represents Tchaikovsky's brief marriage to a person named Antonina Milyukova. Remember, he was a gay man. And so this marriage was a kind of what you would call a lavender marriage or a beard. As a fake marriage, or as a marriage that allowed a gay man to have children. But it didn't last long. He freaked out for reasons we'll talk about a little later on. But here's the clip in question.
Добрый вечер, сударыня. Вас ожидают?
Нет. То есть, да, у меня там муж.
Как?
Муж, мне к мужу надо.
Ну, позвольте, сударыня, однако... господа...
Это унижение музыки.
А ведь не дурно?
Не дурно, не дурно.
Машина играет хуже человека, это же слышно.
Ну играет же. Не каждый человек так сыграет, а в ноту попадает.
Не знаю, я на педали с большой душой жму.
Талантливо.
Будет у вас оркестр из одних автоматонов.
Вы намекаете на Гофмана?
Я в любом случае предпочту филармонию походу в ресторан.
Вы, господа, снобы и консерваторы.
Okay, that's it. So there's Antonina Milyukova, Tchaikovsky's wife, for just a couple of weeks, and confronting him in this sort of back salon of this, underground place. The film does represent Tchaikovsky as being seriously freaked out about this marriage that he got himself involved in, But the bigger point is actually this is a film with very little sunlight in it. It's largely shot underground, but it's actually his seeming kind of emasculation, or how he's represented as being this emasculated gay man, is actually a symbol for the entire structure of this kind of repressive patriarchal society in which all males are emasculated by the state. And this is represented over and over again in the film. What's great about this film is the kind of 19th century representations of Tchaikovsky as a composer working with string quartets in the conservatory environment, and I highly recommend it. It's available with these subtitles, as you see here. It did receive awards at the Cannes Festival, and it's actually a fascinating kind of restoration of the look and feel of the world in which he lived. The other thing before we get going formally here is this photograph of Tchaikovsky, which is not a photograph of Tchaikovsky, and but it actually appears in various books about Tchaikovsky. This is a photograph of somebody who looks like him, but kind of far more haggard and wrung out and even wretched looking. Cigarette, the snow on the roof, all of that. But this is far more dark-eyed and brooding version of him than actually the real Tchaikovsky. But this image is actually reproduced in publications to richly stress the idea of the burdened, suffering, gloomy, despondent, abject, even whatever you want to call it. Choose your adjective version of the composer. All right, so who's the real guy? When I wrote this book, I wanted to find out. I tried my best. And what I did was I decided to write a book using archival stuff from various archives in the Russian Federation, primarily, and a lot in St. Petersburg, and a lot of our archival materials that aren't in the usual chain of Tchaikovsky place, including where he lived at the end of his life. And I just wanted to look at him as, part of a system and look at the network of relationships and friendships he had. So one thing to remember about Tchaikovsky is that one of the habits for people in the 19th century of, what you would consider to be middle class, sort of middle rung in the table of ranks in that society, was you had two choices for educating your child, male child. One was to send them to cadet school in St. Petersburg, or the other is to send them to kind of law school or the school of jurisprudence. In the case of Tchaikovsky, they sent him to law school. And this was a terrible experience for him because he grew up outside of St. Petersburg, quite far away, actually, in the Ural Mountains. His father ran a bunch of mines. He was a mining kind of administrator. And so early on, he developed what seemed to be a natural gift for music, kind of Mozartian music. He'd hear music in his head. He'd hear music in his head when he was dreaming that didn't exist. He couldn't sometimes get the music out of his head. It was a kind of torment for him when he was a 4-year-old boy. So he had this incredible natural sort of ear and gift, and it was obvious that this was a possible vocation for him, except for the fact that being a professional composer really didn't exist. You could be a professional musician. You could be a professional performer. That was considered to be very prestigious. But the idea of being a full-time composer was really not on the books when he was growing up in the 1840s. But nonetheless, he took music lessons, and it was going to be a sort of second, aspect of his existence, a kind of social aspect. They sent him to law school, his mom. And simultaneously, at this point, what was being formed in St. Petersburg was the future Conservatory of Music. And so Tchaikovsky did finish law school, School of Jurisprudence. He did work for a couple of years, at a sort of lesser bureaucratic rank, just, doing paperwork. But meantime, he actually did formal studies in composition, and he became the first really distinguished graduate of a very small group of students from what was the future St. Petersburg Conservatory, which operated out of an estate at that period in time. So he graduated, and his mentor there was a person named Anton Rubinstein, who was Russian Jewish and really all about German music. And so what was put into Tchaikovsky early on as a student was, the German Romantic tradition. And Tchaikovsky was not particularly tapped in or, fond of this tradition. He was more interested in French music of earlier times. He did love Mozart. But he was really drawn to Aubert and these other sort of 18th, 19th century French composers, which really influenced his sound, and particularly his orchestral choices as a composer. Anyway, so he graduates. He's no longer involved in the bureaucratic, civil service. And Anton Rubinstein's brother Nikolai, who was a pianist, was looking after the newly established Moscow Conservatory, which was a younger institution than the young St. Petersburg Conservatory, and Tchaikovsky was hired there. And what's not really stressed in the literature is that Tchaikovsky, in his 30s, was a full-time music prof. And when people do write about this period, they say, oh, he really hated it. He didn't like teaching, he didn't like his students, da 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 da, anecdote here, anecdote there. But in fact, he actually was really committed to this job. And he actually taught various levels here. And here's a list of some of basically average kind of sort of list of courses here. And you see Professor Pyotr Tchaikovsky here teaching instrumentovka or обязательно. So it's obligatory for a conservatory student to learn orchestration, and it's taught here by Tchaikovsky. You see the other profs there. Again, Tchaikovsky here. Here's Garmonia, harmony, Professor Tchaikovsky. And there's other faculty members, Razumovsky, who actually did church music at this period of time, the wonderful musicologist Laroche, who did counterpoint, probably not so well, and then a couple of German imports in there. And so this is kind of, he was on the books for many, many years. He taught 10 years in all, and this is actually how he brought in income. Okay. And he produced several students. He was a young man. He was in his 30s as a young teacher. And he picked up students who were basically of the same age as him. And a lot of the unknown, unpublished correspondence of Tchaikovsky surrounds the fact that all of these guys socialized at a place that no longer exists, but basically kind of a restaurant cafe called the Petrikishka. And this is near the Kremlin. And this over here would be where the current Bolshoi Theater would be, Bolshoi, the Art Square area there. And that's the Manege kind of exhibition space currently now. So this is where he'd hung out, and he befriended, and there's a reason why I'm telling you this, he befriended his students too closely in some instances. And this was a circle of young men. Many of them seemed to have been homosexual. And one of the people that he mentored early on was a good composer who became a really fascinating figure named Raphael van Keber, who came from Nizhny Novgorod. So that it's a German-Russian enclave. And Nizhny Novgorod was a place that actually Tchaikovsky himself really adored, and he wrote a lot of pieces that are set in that area. And he befriended Raphael van Keber, and they became friends up to the point when Tchaikovsky died in 1893, and then van Keber, who was a composer and then spent a lot of time in Germany and became a philosopher, and then ended up in Japan. And there he had a wonderful and distinguished and strange career as actually, sort of the person who brought Western philosophy and a lot of music from Russia and Europe to Japan at this period in time. So this is van Keber, but the two of them had this correspondence, and these are just images from some of the letters that van Keber wrote to Tchaikovsky. They had, friends and students in common, including a couple of kids who, were seemingly, again, homosexual, and one of them committed suicide early on. And this was a source of great discomfort, trauma, horror for Tchaikovsky as well as van Keber. And this was part of the kind of circle he kept when in his 30s he was part of the Moscow Conservatory. Okay, continue here. So this is the person that he married, Antonina Milyukova. This story about this marriage that didn't work out is front and center in the biographies and discussions of this composer. It's the idea that somehow he impulsively married this person whom he didn't know, and then just as impulsively broke up with her, and that it was a complete fiasco, and he realized for the first time to his horror that he could not countenance, he could not understand female sexuality, and that he was fundamentally doomed in his homosexuality. Okay, this is the story. The truth, however, is that Antonina Milyukova was a student herself of the Moscow Conservatory, that she and Tchaikovsky knew each other for about 6 years before this sort of fabricated marriage. She was in and out of the conservatory. She wasn't a particularly strong student. She wasn't rich. In sort of 19th century standards, her family owned about three villages, so it wasn't, so wealthy. But basically, the arrangement was that he said to her, he said, "Well, we're doing this, as of course we cannot possibly have kind of what you'd consider to be normal, whatever, heterosexual relationship. This is all." And she agreed to that. Her mother knew all about this. But nonetheless, even that amount of commitment to her, when he realized this meant living with her, that she had rented a place for them, spending a lot of time with her, and actually cutting down on his social life as well as his travel life, he completely lost his mind and ended this relationship. And the problem for that is that, okay, relationships end, right? Even in the 19th century, they end. But the laws at that period in time meant that in order for him to get a divorce from this person, she needed to petition for that, which would have been a great humiliation and shame for her. Would have stigmatized her for life. And so she never did divorce him. And all that happened was they separated and he provided her with an allowance. She went on to have other relationships. And then at one point late in life, when she had children with a lawyer who abandoned her, she actually asked Tchaikovsky if he would adopt her own children from another relationship. And he was interested in doing so. But his travel and his, obligations did not permit him for doing so. So although he hated this poor girl for not granting him the divorce, which was for her dignity, they did nonetheless maintain contact throughout his life. Okay, so that's the end of the kind of biographical stuff I'm going to tell you. Now let's talk about this piece. This is Swan Lake. You're just seeing here. Okay, so this is obviously one of the pieces that when people think about when they think about Tchaikovsky, Swan Lake is probably the most popular ballet in the canon. It's performed thousands of times a year across the planet. And it's for a lot of people, when they think about ballet and its cliches and stereotypes, it is the work that first comes to mind. Tchaikovsky, when he composed this piece, he didn't know anything about ballet. And what's fascinating about this composition is that everybody goes and sees it. And when I have the opportunity to teach it, one of the things I get students to do is listen to the music and then look at the dance, and then you see how completely, in a weird way, unrelated they are. I'll explain this in a moment. When Tchaikovsky wrote this ballet, he was still involved in the Moscow Conservatory as a teacher. He was pretty broke. As he was for years, and he's constantly borrowing money from colleagues and friends and paying them back. And he did this project for about 700 rubles, which was substantial, not great, but substantial. And he did it as a favor for a friend of his, one of that sort of circle of friends he had, a person named Vladimir Begachev, who was the person who was kind of the manager of the orchestra of the Bolshoi Theater, as well as somebody who was in charge of, picking libretti and getting them together. And so Begachev actually wrote the plot of Swan Lake. Until a couple of years ago, nobody knew who wrote the story of Swan Lake, despite it being the most popular ballet in the canon. But now we know it's Vladimir Begachev. And Tchaikovsky didn't know anything about ballet, as noted. And ballet composition was not considered very prestigious. Opera composition was more prestigious, and writing symphonies was yet more prestigious, because this art form was, particularly in Moscow, was second tier. It was not well funded. It was associated with, tawdriness and scandal and, abuse of various sorts. It didn't pay well, and the works came and went, and they were kind of slipshod and didn't hang together very well. But nonetheless, he took on this project as a favor to his friend, Begachev, and because he needed the cash. And so that little bit of music I played here, of that piece of music for the little swanlings, baby swans, was actually something that Tchaikovsky had composed before this commission for Swan Lake. It was actually something that at his sister's place, at a sort of birthday party for her children, he did a little bit of animal improvisation at the piano, and he came up with that and he remembered it. The other thing we know about Swan Lake is Tchaikovsky at this point had seen maybe two or three ballets, and he he had to study up like how a ballet is constructed, and we know that he actually went to the library of the Bolshoi Theater and took home some ballet scores from ballets that are lost, in part because he took home the music and didn't return the scores. So there's one that was called The Fern, like Fern, by a person named Gerber, who that score has disappeared. But we know that Tchaikovsky borrowed it, and the suspicion is perhaps some of the music of Swan Lake is derived from this other score by a colleague. All right, so ballet at this period in time was a fairly impoverished thing. It was second tier, as noted. He did it for the money. Here are a couple of the images that were published before the premiere in 1877 of the first version of Swan Lake. These images were published along with the plot, so people could read the plot and look at pictures before going to the show if they desired to in Moscow. And one of the things you immediately see here is that these pictures are also reproduced with an opera called William Tell. So basically, at this point in time, ballet was recycling the sets used for operas. And so these sets came down on the train from St. Petersburg and were used for this thrown together show called Swan Lake. All right. And one of the things that is fascinating, we can do this little exercise together, is that when you actually listen to the music and then you look at the visuals of how it's usually performed, and there's a set way in which the choreography is now done as a kind of petit pas, originally, it's a sort of adaptation of choreography by Marius Petipa, which was actually done after Tchaikovsky died. And you listen to the music and you look at the visuals and you see they don't have very much in common. Here's the example I'll give you for this. This is from Act One. This is the dance for three people. And in Act One, all that happens is you meet our hero, a guy named Siegfried, German name there. He's a prince, and his mom, who's the princess, wants him to get married. And so there's this kind of village, kind of community party, and he's dancing with various, potential, I suppose, girlfriends or brides. He's unimpressed. He's unhappy with his potential there, and then wanders off into this supernatural realm of the swans that take place in Act Two. So here's this dance for three in Act One. Repeat the phrase. And then repeats again, but there's difference in the undercurrent. Contrasting section in the music. Music trails off here. Dissolution. Texture continues to dissolve musically. Instability, waywardness. And then it snaps back. Okay, so why am I showing you this? All right, so you get phrase A, ba da 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 dum da dee da dee da da da. They dance that way. Then da 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 repeats. They dance the same thing, same choreographic dance phrase, music phrase, right? Three people on the stage, they're all doing the same thing. Then the whole block repeats, but then there's this weird kind of serpentine kind of undercurrent beneath that original theme, right? Which the dance doesn't seem to acknowledge at all. They just actually repeat the original phrase, even though the music has changed. That serpentine line comes back again. They still dance the original phrase. So you get basically in the dance, you get A, and the music gives you A, B, kind of thing. And then it drifts away, sort of dissolves, falls apart, gets a little slippery and ambiguous, and then snaps back in, but the dancers just continue to sort of count the beats without actually recognizing or doing anything to mimic or respond to that sort of dissolution in the texture. Why is this important? This is one of the examples that actually tells you that actually what we hear and what we see are not related, owing to the fact that the music Tchaikovsky wrote is for a plot that is no longer used. Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake was a flop. It did not succeed. It was put on the stage in 1877. It was choreographed by a person named Wenzel Rasinger, who was Czech, whose family basically worked in the circus. He was one of the choreographers that kind of passed through the Bolshoi Theater and did productions for a couple of years just to keep the ballet going, even though it was very underfunded at this period in time, the Bolshoi. He was there for a couple of years and left. He put on this show. He recycled a lot of choreography from other shows that he had done. We know this from the manuscripts, and it was not considered well received. It sort of just was performed for a couple of years. Tchaikovsky saw it. He was like, he saw the rehearsals. He didn't understand, like, why is the choreographer playing the violin and hopping around, showing them the steps? He thought it was all very absurd. And it fell off the books. And then another choreographer named Josef Hansen came in, passed through, did it again, and it hung on till 1833 and it disappeared, all to be forgotten. It was never done in St. Petersburg. It was just a sort of local show. Then Tchaikovsky, when he became super famous, did Sleeping Beauty, which is a gorgeous, sumptuous thing. And this is again sort of late 1880s, towards the end of his life, and then just before he died, he did the Nutcracker. And after he died, the person who had choreographed the Nutcracker and Sleeping Beauty, the very famous, respected Grand Ballet choreographer Marius Petipa, said, we should do something in memoriam for Tchaikovsky, given his great contributions to the art in his fame. What was that ballet he did when he was young that failed? And so he said, oh, that thing, Swan Lake. And so they dug that up and they decided to put it on the stage in memoriam for Tchaikovsky. And Petipa went through the plot and he said, this plot is too crazy and complicated. We need to change it all around. And in order to make the music work, we need to actually change the music and et cetera, and reorchestrate parts of it and so on and so forth. So when you see Swan Lake these days, you're seeing choreography for a plot that wasn't what Tchaikovsky wrote music for, music that's all changed, reorchestrated by another person, just a kind of slimmed down, kind of straightened out hodgepodge. Coming back to this example, why this is interesting is when you look at the original plot, in Act 1 of the ballet, you have, the princess says, I want my son to get married. And he dances with girls from the village. One of them is nice, chaste, proper girl, danced by a very sophisticated ballerina we know from the masthead. But he's drawn to another girl from outside, sort of more, if you will, if you want to be stereotypical, a kind of gypsy kind of figure. And Tchaikovsky introduces that wayward second line for her. So it's like, here's girl A, I'm going to dance to her, and then here's the girl I'm really attracted to, right? And that would be the second phase. And this choreography doesn't respect that idea that these two females that he's dancing with are very different people from different realms. That was the construction here, because in the original version, there's this drama between he's attracted to someone from outside, his mom wants him to be with somebody from inside the village. Then we go into Act 2, where he encounters this sort of, he enters this sort of supernatural space where he meets this beautiful swan princess. And then later in the work, he's actually seduced by her other, this sort of, so basically there's this sort of drama that takes place in the real world between the familiar and the other, and that's actually replicated in a supernatural or mythological plane. That was the original plot of this work, and that's totally ignored in most productions these days. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is this most famous part of the ballet. This is the Black Swan seduction scene from Act 3. There were no black swans in the original version of this work. This is a contrivance from really the Second World War period. But just listen to the music. This is supposedly seduction music of this, the black swan seducing our hero Siegfried. And this is what it sounds like. So this is the most famous part here. I'll just keep this up here. Okay. To here. Okay, this is the famous whipping fouetté, 32 of them she's supposed to do. 1, 2, 3, and so forth. Okay, so this has to be performed all of the time. This sequence of very virtuosic steps, it's incredibly difficult to do. She doesn't quite do 32, but that's the sort of standard. This was a pattern that was actually brought into the ballet after Tchaikovsky's death by an Italian ballerina whom Maria Petipa prized and wanted her to perform for him in St. Petersburg. And one of the things that she could do very well were these whipping fouettés. And this was her house specialty. And so she insisted to doing them, even though for the purposes of seducing Siegfried, this might not be the most kind of sensual, erotic kind of demonstration. It's a great demonstration of, physical acumen, but it's not particularly seductive. Okay, so but this dancer from Italy, Lignani, she insisted on this, and Petipa said, "All right, we're going to do Swan Lake in memoriam for Tchaikovsky, so you get to do this in the seduction scene, but we need to find some music for you." And you actually listen to this music, pati, 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 pata, ta, 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 ta. It's kind of circusy music, right? It's not seductive music at all. And in fact, this music comes from, this is Act 3, but this music is recycled from the end of Act 1, the village scene. Because at the end of Act 1, in the original version of the work, you actually have all of the villagers. There's this great party. Siegfried's there with his mom. She wants him to get married. He likes the girl from elsewhere. She wants him, da 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 da. And at the end, there's a kind of party, a group dance, sort of a dance with goblets, sort of a drinking dance. Ba-dee, da-dee, da-da, sort of dancing, everybody dancing together in this kind of community revelry. That's where this music comes from. And actually you hear it and you think, yeah, that's actually pretty good drinking, dancing music. But what they did was they transported it to Act 3. And this happens over and over and over again with this score. If you actually look at the original score and then you look at how it's performed nowadays, it's a completely different, tangled up thing. I will say that part of the reason the original version of Swan Lake didn't succeed was how devastatingly sad it is. I mean, at the end, Siegfried drowns as well as his beloved. It's just completely relentlessly merciless. And it was so dark and gloomy that, people left the theater completely bummed out. Also, they used a lot of special effects at this time that were very noisy. And but still, the music hung together. It's a very symphonic score. He was used to writing symphonies. He'd done a couple of this period in time, so he structured it very much like a symphony in terms of the treatment of themes and development of ideas. But people were baffled by it, and I've often thought it'd be interesting to kind of restore the original version, which would be the source of a great deal of critical scorn. I could just imagine it. But if you're going to do something like that, you'd have to imagine actually what it's like to actually go to a theater where there's no electricity, where there's a use of batteries for a couple of special effects scene, where there's actually the lights don't go down in the theater, and on and on and on and on and on. So it's just a kind of impossible and strange thing to imagine. But what's interesting is to think that this score, which doesn't sound particularly good when it's performed, sounds an awful lot better when it's actually performed in the correct order. So I think at least the original version of the music should be recorded. That's just my opinion. All right, let's go on to something else here. I got two other people to talk about. I will say that one of the dances that's never performed in Swan Lake, except rarely in Europe, is this one of Siegfried alone when he realizes, maybe I'll never get married. I don't like any of these people I've met. And you have this beautiful passage for English horn. I love this because of the fact that it's very similar to this piece of medieval music by Guillaume de Machaut. Um, it's interesting to think, I mean, it's very similar. It's interesting to think that fantasize that Tchaikovsky might have had some exposure to this medieval music from the 14th century somehow in 19th century Russia. I don't think it's the case, but he did have, for this particular scene of, moroseness and loneliness. This is a very deep and rich score in terms of the kind of textures that he invokes, and that's generally not something you hear, and certainly in ballets in the 1840s and 50s and 60s and 70s. But it's also not something you think of characteristically of ballet as really exploring these kind of textures and emotional states. So you have it here in this piece. Okay, so let's go on to the theme that's also front and center in the biography, and we'll relate that to the music. All right, so what got Tchaikovsky out of his teaching career, which and cemented his finances and actually allowed him to no longer need to be married to somebody of modest means, was the fact that he was kind of discovered by a person named Nadezhda von Meck. Nadezhda von Meck was considered to be, again, this is misogyny for you, she's considered to be the wealthy widow of a person who built the railroads of Russia. Now, the railroads of Russia were privately built in the 19th century, and the person that built the railroad from Moscow to Nizhny Novgorod made a huge amount of money. And that was the husband of Nadezhda von Meck, Mr. von Meck. We now know, though, that Nadezhda von Meck was actually the brains behind this business entrepreneurship. And her husband was basically a middling kind of engineer who would not have actually done the bold things he did without her influence. So she was the brains of this operation. So although that's not how she's represented. So he died. Big family, brothers, sisters, and inherited wealth that was built up. Wealth that actually was doomed to dwindle and disappear once the government started privatizing the railroads and building themselves. So this became a problem for the von Meck family in later years. But when in the 1870s, Nadezhda von Meck, she had, fabulous amount of money to travel. She traveled heavily to Europe, France, Italy, etc. And she also, because she loved music, she would actually sponsor concerts, performances, and a little salon at her place in Moscow. And one of the violinists that she loved was a devotee of Tchaikovsky. And through that relationship, she actually heard Tchaikovsky's music, had him over, and actually decided she was going to fund him as a composer, a full-time professional composer. And this allowed him to basically do what he wanted for a long time, travel extensively. And he spent a lot of time, years and years outside of Russia, staying at places that she had recommended, and sometimes in Russia, staying at her estates so he could have peace and quiet to compose. And so she was really important to him. And she funded him, 6,000 rubles a year, which was a lot of money, until the finances in the family dwindled. And then she had to end that relationship. But by then, Tchaikovsky was just so established as an imperial composer receiving commissions, he didn't need the money anymore. So this was a very happy relationship. But the one thing about Nadezhda von Meck was she was very much enchanted by German romantic music. And Tchaikovsky was not himself particularly Beethovenian or Schumannesque. He did, borrow some things and had some influences. But again, his interests were primarily the sort of French sound, and as well as certain aspects of the Russian traditions that he picked from spending time with Balakirev and others. So when he wrote to her about his music, that he was obliged to do because she was basically funding it, he tended to kind of describe the works in a way that actually would appeal to her. And so he wrote this wonderful Fourth Symphony in 1878. And he wrote a letter to her, actually, and it's transcribed here on the image, in which he talks about it. And he says, the introduction is a theme that occurs several times. This is him writing a letter. So look, this is a symphony I wrote, by the way. I'm dedicating it to you. And here's what's going on in it. So this is a very famous letter in which you actually have rarely a composer talking about what goes on moment to moment within one of his compositions. Like he wrote his own program notes for this piece. And he goes on and on. He says, so there's this theme you hear at the start called fate, right? Fatal power. It hinders the pursuit of happiness. Da 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 da. There's nothing you can do but to submit to fate. Fate, 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 fate. Second theme then comes in, and fate is a more dreamy second theme after the fate music, and then it's broken up and destroyed by fate, and on and on and on. And it goes on. This description is very much this idea that this is kind of like you can't be happy in this world if you exercise free will. These forces are going to crush you. So this is what he writes to her about this symphony. And this is one of those letters that's always used in the biographies to say, see, he was this kind of guilt-ridden, homosexual man. He was constantly doomed, suicidal, and on and on and on. Okay? So this is what's out there in the literature. And then you hear the piece, and yeah, the beginning. Fate, right? Louder yet? This is what we can call a transition to the second theme, which is the dreamy music that he mentions in that letter. Okay, so according to the letter, this is fate, this opening, ba, da, 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 and then there's this sort of dreaminess that comes in, and that little pattern there is a sort of slivery, slinky waltz, and then it's kind of crushed by fate again, and on and on and on. So this is what he writes, and this again is in the literature about the composer, allegorized as somehow about his doom and the idea that he was living this forbidden lifestyle and he'd just gotten divorced and all of this. And so he wrote this symphony, this, confessing like, they're out to get me. I'm going to be crushed by these repressive forces of outside. And okay, it's a good story. He actually wrote this symphony in Venice, of all places, in a restaurant. He drafted that opening. And one of the things he was interested in was the fact that the symbol of Venice, I have not myself been there, is two lions. And these two lions represent, in his mind, the sort of opposite forces of life itself, the good and the bad, the yin and the yang of things. And so the original title of this symphony was called Two Lions. And you can go to the restaurant in the hotel he stayed at, and there's actually still a plaque there, which says Tchaikovsky wrote this symphony and he da 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 da, and he drafted. This is one of his this incredible kind of grand tour moments where he was able to go to a hotel in Venice and just get a rented piano in a room with all of his friends staying with him for 3 months and just like work and just have a good time in the city. And this is where he drafted this piece. So it was originally called Two Lions. And so this oppositions between, positive and negative forces is this initially in the original conception. And then the other thing is that with regard to the fate thing, besides the fact that, Beethoven da 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 da, knocking of fate at the door. A lot of this idea of an obsession with fate comes from a poet friend of Tchaikovsky's named Alexei Aputin, who is another gay man, and he actually wrote this poem around the time that Tchaikovsky was writing this symphony, talking about fate and death, and with its walking stick, fate like a formidable sentinel follows us everywhere. It's fate, da 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 da. And this imagery was actually something that actually merged with the symphony. So it wasn't so much his personal things as his relationship with this poet, who was very fate-minded, as well as his experience in Venice, that actually led to the conception of the Fourth Symphony. And then he tailored the description of it to suit Nadezhda von Meck's, German romantic sort of interests. Why this is important is that Aputin died in 1892. And before he died, he actually asked Tchaikovsky to actually consider, in order to bolster his own standing as a sort of semi-successful poet, if he would consider writing a piece using the words of a poem that Aputin wrote called Requiem, poem about death. And Tchaikovsky was not interested, but then suddenly Aputin died. And Tchaikovsky then became very interested in writing a piece in memoriam, or a piece about a Putin, or sort of requiem piece. And that piece was the Pathetique Symphony. It was for this guy. It wasn't about Tchaikovsky himself. Although every time you read about the Pathetique Symphony, you will read this narrative. This is a book about it, which is all about the idea that somehow this is some sort of homosexual confession and suicide note, when in fact Tchaikovsky, when he finished the Pathetique, before he contracted cholera, he was full of ideas for other compositions, and he was going to respond to this piece about death with another piece celebrating life, as well as actually write another ballet score about the samurai of all things. So this myth is very popular. It's exciting for a lot of people. It's fascinating, if only it were true, but it's not, alas, in my opinion, and from what I've learned. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is this. Some of you might know this language. This is what the guy was like, Tchaikovsky. This is an unpublished letter, and still there are diaries and letters that are unpublished. And Tchaikovsky, part of the reason he was constantly worried about fate, maybe, or constantly worried about his health, was the fact that the entire Tchaikovsky family suffered from digestive issues, troubles. And in this letter, he actually says that, he's on a train going out to Paris. And he writes this letter from Paris in 1876, right? And he says, yeah, this is how I'm feeling in my stomach. And he draws a little doodle of himself. And then he goes on to talk about, his trip. And you'll actually see here, he says, I arrived, it was all really good. And then I sat in the coupe car and da da da. And he says, I went around, I crapped, slept to my heart's content. The soupomania, he said, ate a lot of soup, et cetera, et cetera. And he talks about all the stuff he ate. And then he talks about getting what he ate, sort of cutlet and in Paris and his old friend and all this sort of like, I went, sort of wandered around Paris and da 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 da. And he talks about all the stuff he ate. He went to the Magazine du Louvre, buys clothing and all that, just all this endless stuff, right? And then he says, oh, by the way, have you talked about Kolya, his friend in common, and then on and on and on and on. And I think somewhere in here he talks about, yes, he says, this morning in the car, I read through the fourth canto of Dante's Inferno, and got all inflamed by the idea of writing a symphonic poem about Francesca da Rimini, which is a scene from Dante's Inferno. And he says, I embrace you with unbelievable tenderness. This is this sort of romantic inflated language. He says, a kiss from me to Kolya in his little eyes, in his cheek, his little hands, and he says, Fofo obnumayo, I squeeze his tushy. He said, remember, I'll be waiting for your letters in Bayreuth. He was going to Munich and Bayreuth for the Wagner Festival there. But this is what he was like. Basically chatty, food, clothing, sort of, talking about men's butts, things like that. And the letters are just burlesque this way, especially when he's writing to his brothers. This is to his brother Modeste. just full of comedy. His sense of humor was really kind of scatological at places, just a kind of goofy guy, plus a genius, of course. All right. Last thing I'll talk about is this. This is to do with the fact that I'm talking to folks associated with Jordanville and the museum there. So we're talking about upstate New York. So this piece, is of all pieces that need no introduction, is this one. When he received the commission for it from the Imperial Theaters, he was the head of the Imperial Theaters, a person named Ivan Vysoloshky, was interested in actually putting on a kind of ballet, which with a lot of children dancers from the Imperial Ballet School. And Christmas time or a holiday time thing based on E.T.A. Hoffmann's story, Nutcracker and Mouse King, and sort of a gothic, scary story for kids, but with magic and all of this kind of New Year's Eve type of fun. So Tchaikovsky got this proposal from the Imperial Theaters, and he was just not really interested in doing it. So he kind of procrastinated for a long time. And then he parked it while also working on his final opera, which also was actually not something he was so committed to, which was Iolanta. And those two works, that final opera, Iolanta, and the Nutcracker, were actually premiered together in 1892. And this meant that people in the 19th century they went to the theater. They had a lot more patience than we do nowadays, because this would have been a very long evening, opera and then ballet, so that the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, it happened at midnight. So a long night at the theater for the premiere. The ballet was premiered in part musically in Moscow before it reached the stage. There was an electrical exhibition in Moscow in 1892. And one of the amazing things, it would have been amazing to see, is they were introducing electricity to Moscow in that time. And they performed the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy with a dancer with sort of, electric bulbs all around her, just to sort of demonstrate electricity. So the suite from the Nutcracker was premiered in advance of the ballet itself. Okay, the reason why I'm telling you all of this is that it's got a fascinating American side to it, because when Tchaikovsky received the commission, he was kind of ambivalent about it. He received the invitation to come to New York City for the opening of what is called Carnegie Hall these days. It was the music hall then. They wanted this famous composer, internationally recognized composer, to come and conduct the opening show and actually maybe write a new piece of music for New York City. So a piano company paid him an enormous amount of money to come for 2 weeks to New York. And they offered him $5,000 currency at that time, which is basically like $100,000 these days. It was a good amount of money, right? So how do you get to the United States from Moscow or outside of Moscow, where he was renting one of his houses? He took a train to Paris, and then from there it goes to Calais, and then you're on the boat. And he's procrastinating about this project. He doesn't want to do Nutcracker. He's traveling. He's got these obligations. He's got to do the Carnegie Hall thing. And then he comes to the United States, and he conducts a piece of recycled music from Russia and pretends it's new. And then he conducts a piano concerto and so forth. Goes to Philadelphia, and then he wanted to see Niagara Falls. So he took the train all the way up to Niagara Falls and back down again. But what's interesting about that trip is that as he was passing through Paris, on the way to the dock in Calais to go to the United States, he wanted to catch up on news from home. And he read new St. Petersburg papers, and he was horrified, an obituary of his own sister, Alexandra, who was morphine addict, alcoholic, various health problems. And she died. And he was gutted. He had spent a lot of his youth with her, and he'd been with her kids, visited on and on again. He remembers taking the train to see her and being between train connections and horse connections, being stuck in an inn, and the walls were full of mice, and that terrified him. See the mice and all this work. Anyway, so that news gutted him, and that was the inspiration for the Nutcracker. Because if you listen to this work, here's just the last snippet I'll give you because I'm running out of time here. This is the concluding pas de deux. You listen to this music. Do this just for this swell here. It's so great. So if you look at, I don't know, David Brown's biography of Tchaikovsky, Volume 4, towards the end, this fellow who wrote 4 books over 15 years about Tchaikovsky and seems somehow to have not really liked a lot of the music he wrote about, he really hated this ballet. And he says, this plot makes no sense. What is this? Kids party, then Candyland? I don't get it. And he said, and this is supposed to be the great moment at the end. The dance for two, the princess and Clara. The Nutcracker turns into a prince and she's a princess and they dance together. And what does he give you here? Just a scale. Dee da 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 dum. Dum da 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 dum da 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 dum, right? Yeah. But part of the Nutcracker is actually taking the most simple childlike things and turning them into magic. And what he does here is he has dee da 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 dum. And of course, it's all about the orchestration shifting each time. Dee da 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 dum. And he drops in this, but note this J, the scale is G to G, and he drops in E, which suddenly that G major scale becomes E minor. So there's this sort of bit of sadness that's introduced to the whole thing. And the pattern D ta ta T ta ta, that rhythmic pattern is actually from it's the standard short rhythmic idea that governs the memorial service music, the panihida in the Russian Orthodox context. So that's in here. And if you actually listen to all of those famous dances in the second act, like the dance of called Arabia or coffee, or the dance called China or green tea, which people politicize these days, that Chinese dance, quote unquote, it goes bria pa pa pam briam pam duncan 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 dun bria pa pa. And you listen to that, it's like, well, what is Chinese about that? Answer: nothing. What is potentially? It's also sometimes called tea. What is tea like about that? Nothing. But what is it? But that bria, that's a tea whistle, because that was the kettle in his sister's place that he remembered going off. And the dance of the snowflakes, the waltz of the snowflakes, which is actually not a waltz at all, but a chaconne, repeated pattern over which variations are added. It's associated with death. He remembered the blizzards around her place. So the whole piece is kind of this personal aspect of the memorial for his sister, as well as being about the plot and its imperial imagery and so on and so forth. And the last thing I'll say here is that what makes this important for our context of New York is when he came to New York, he knew that his sister had died. He had motivation to do this piece in memoriam for her. And when he went up to Niagara Falls on the train, that's when he began sketching the most famous piece in his entire career, which is the Sugar Plum Fairy variation. Okay. I'm going to pause it there because I'm out of time, and I'm happy to take any questions you have. And thank you very much.
Let's start with questions. There are many, and we have some time. There is a question from Edward. He sent it before you mentioned the Carnegie Hall story, but he was wondering Do we have any information about what Tchaikovsky said when he was at the opening of Carnegie Hall in New York? And I would probably extend it to his general impressions on America. What did he think about New York, about American people? I heard that he thought that he was even more famous in the US than in Europe. He wasn't a huge fan of New York, but you know best. So could you please speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I know a little bit about this because, well, first of all, there is a book actually published called Tchaikovsky in America, and which, given that he was only there for a couple of weeks, it's amazing that you could write an entire book about that. But when I wrote about this period in his final year, full year, I did have some dialogue with the Carnegie Hall archivist and wanted to find out exactly this, like what he conducted. And he conducted a sort of Russian overture piece, and he conducted, this piano concerto. And he basically didn't have very much English, so all he could do was basically, introduce himself and introduce the works. They didn't give him a translator, so he just tried his best. So he didn't say much at the concert itself. We do, however, have the letters and his recollections of his time in New York. And he came in really quite freaked out about, the idea of being in the city. He'd heard, his sort of primitive, barbaric descriptions of the United States, but he was completely bedazzled by New York. And the thing that he was interesting because, he tended to fixate on things that you normally wouldn't think that a visitor to a city in a different country would fixate on. He was very fascinated by the hat wear. So he talked a lot about, the kind of clothing men wore and the fashion side of it and everything. And so that became of interest to him. He loved the train ride. We know that. He was desperate to see Niagara Falls. This is something that one of the things that he was really interested in was reading stories about far-flung places and different geographies. And so this was part of the discussion. So the short answer is basically that I encourage you to look at this book about Tchaikovsky in the United States, where you get all the recollections. They're a lot of fun. That he didn't actually speak much. That the concert was well received, that he was generally well received, that he was squired around by the piano company that brought him there, and they spoke Russian with him. And yeah, that he also was very enamored by Philadelphia because he went down there for another concert. So it's not as much information as we would like, goodness knows. He was preoccupied. He didn't have a lot of time for socializing. He's actually somebody who actually really found it hard to socialize, even though he had to meet the czars and so forth at the end of his life. So it was somewhat encumbered because he needed also private time for himself. But that book does give you everything you need to know about it.
Thank you so much. I actually didn't know that he was in Philadelphia. This is a very interesting story to discover, to read about after your talk. I'm sure now we are all inspired to learn more about Tchaikovsky, but I personally have learned so much today because in Russia we're taught basic things, and I'm really glad that we focused on some really unknown stories from his life. There is a good question from Doug. I think it's very interesting. How did the Bolsheviks view his work? And was Tchaikovsky a favored artist in the early Soviet Union, and why?
So after the revolution, he was not performed because the revolution, after 1917, there was a period of an amazing experiment that took place in the first 10 years, the remaining years of Lenin's life and a little bit afterwards, in which various artistic isms became popular. So expressionism a little bit, but constructivism, the biomechanics associated with different things. Basically, the idea of transformation of humankind and the human being through this revolutionary activity, futurism, etc. Tchaikovsky was a composer who was very much interested in everyday people and regular people, and the idea that, as much as when you read a history book, you hear about great events, wars, calamities, atrocities, but actually the things that matter to most people everywhere are the sort of smaller profundities, like a death of a friend or a grandmother or something like that, or marriage. And he was really interested in these sort of smaller stories. So he was not considered to be, the sort of flaming kind of Promethean kind of revolutionary figure. And so after the revolution, he was not performed very much at all. There was no interest in it. There was, however, still this tradition and need to actually, kids wanted to see the Nutcracker, and so the ballets were performed. There was a lot of unhappiness with the Tchaikovsky family about the fact that the Bolsheviks started performing them without paying royalties. The state suddenly owned all of this music, but basically his bigger works and his reputation dwindled. It was rekindled, however, in the 1930s because under the aesthetic that was developed by an organization called the Comité de l'Art Искусств, or the Committee on Arts Affairs, there was an effort to both retrieve and sanitize the great Russian tradition. So this meant new publications of great writers like Tolstoy and Pushkin, obviously, for their various centennials and anniversaries, sanitized to actually emphasize the works that they composed that seemed to be proto-revolutionary or this kind of thing, or progressive, or resistance to czarist oppression. And so one of the interesting things that developed is that when they looked at Tchaikovsky, who was, a great 19th century composer, his sound, because it was so accessible, because it was so emotionally moving, was actually thought of as actually the perfect ingredient for creating music that would be, accessible to the masses. So it had broad appeal, and that you could take those sounds and fit them into operas and ballets and even symphonies that actually would represent sort of heroic revolutionary ideals. So this became one of the sound elements of what became the aesthetic of socialist realism. So he was turned into a classic under Stalin. And fascinatingly, when it came time to publish his letters, most of them were published. There was some censorship of things he would say that were, considered to be, too elitist. But in the first edition of his letters, published in 1933, it says right in the introduction, it's under Stalin, Tchaikovsky was a homosexual, right? And then later, this idea had to be suppressed altogether. So the Soviets suppressed anything to do with his sexual private life because he was a transcendent great artist. And so you're beyond sexuality and all of that stuff, and the plumbing of the body. And so that became the gateway for scholars who left Russia and for Americans and British people to say, see, the Russians, the Soviets suppressing this truth about this composer, sanitizing, whitewashing it. And so we know the tawdry details. And right now in the current politic in Russia with Mr. Putin and company, because I was there for a cultural forum a few years ago where he went up on stage, Mr. Putin, and he gives this talk to the gathered cultural officials, and I'm there as this kind of American idiot. And sitting there, and he's like, we defend here, traditional conservative values and culture. And we're not like those people in the West, the groping and hacking and all the rest of it. And Tchaikovsky came up and said, see, they want to just completely obsess and expose his bedroom and his bed sheets. And here we are defending, his transcendent art. So it's a long and strange story, but basically after the revolution, silenced and then gradually recuperated as for his accessibility, and that could be used as a vehicle for promoting certain kind of socialist ideas.
Mm-hmm. There is also a question from Edward. To what extent was George Balanchine influenced by Tchaikovsky?
Balanchine set a lot of Tchaikovsky's music. He set the Serenade, which was a piece that Tchaikovsky composed for the Russian Imperial Music Society. He rearranged the order of the movements. He also did a version of the Nutcracker, which is the super popular version that's performed every year by New York City Ballet. It's more American in the terms of like it's super about sugar. In the second act, there's more sweetness than in the original version, which was, more or less just about honey and a few other things. But one of the interesting things about the Balanchine version of the Nutcracker is it always included a hoop dance that actually was cut from later productions because Balanchine had danced in the work when he was a kid. And that hoop dance was actually something that he remembers performing in and was actually preserved in notation as well as a cartoon strip. And his version of the Nutcracker is actually the only version that's performed worldwide that actually preserves that one original dance that was actually later on cut. So tremendous influence there. And of course, Tchaikovsky was, although he's, a lot of the Soviet treatment of him and the way he's recorded these days is all about the passion and sort of syrupy lugubriousness of the music. He had a neoclassical sense, a strong Mozartian element to him, and he did write a piece called Mozartiana, which is a very kind of, you know, culinary version of Mozart. And Balanchine, as a neoclassical choreographer, was really drawn to that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Dr. Morrison. And the very last question I'll ask you today is about the Nutcracker. We spoke about it during the talk and mentioned in the Q&A, but do we know how exactly the piece became so famous in the West specifically? Who and what was behind it? Maybe specific groups in what countries? So basically, why now it's performed everywhere all the time, especially around Christmas season? How come it's specifically the Nutcracker?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it's the most popular ballet that's performed in the United States, and for most American ballet companies, regional, smaller cities, it is the budget for the year. They base their budget of the year. We're going to sell out the Nutcracker, and we can do a few other things over the course of the year. So it's incredibly important. It's associated with Christmas time, obviously, in the United States. The original version, I mean, Christmas was not was a religious holiday and wasn't commercial. And in the original context, it's a New Year's Eve kind of spectacular. The original run was semi-successful. There's a lot of interesting plot similarities between the ballet and the opera it was paired with, the Iolanta. They're both about young girls. Tchaikovsky was really fascinated by young girls. In a way, he just really loved their imagination and spirit, and a lot of works about them. But it became popular in the 20th century, beginning in the 1930s and 40s. It was promoted as a kind of holiday spectacular by dancers that had left Russia, including Rudolf Nureyev, who actually came to Paris and then was on London. And without Nureyev, we wouldn't have the Russian classics like Bayader, et cetera, performed in the West. And Nureyev was actually the person that actually established the core repertoire, what is now the Royal Ballet in London. And so that was basically the conduit, is these immigrant dancers bringing out these roles that they knew. Balanchine, obviously, when he came to the United States, he remembered this work as well. And so he saw immediate potential for commercial success with it. So it's never been as popular in Russia as it's been outside of Russia. And it has to do with these commercial opportunities and this holiday tradition that actually these dancers actually really literally capitalized on. I will say that because the work was, uh, there was during the Cold War, there was the divide in Germany between East Germany and West Germany. The Nutcracker was performed in West Germany, and the East Germans decided they needed to have their own version of the Nutcracker. And that actually became Richard Strauss. Actually did a ballet about sweets and kids getting sick on sweets called Schlagober, on whipped cream. And so there was this kind of Cold War version, East Bloc version of the Nutcracker that was performed in the East, while the Nutcracker was actually championed in the West. The last thing I'll say is, because of the work being Americanized, Europeanized, we don't kind of perform it with all the music. There's 3 or 4 dances that are cut, which should be performed. I don't know why, like the English dance isn't performed. And we lose a lot of what was some really beautiful details about it. That the original work, again, I mentioned, emphasizing the idea that it has this personal aspect about the death of his sister. But, there's a reason why the soldiers are in red uniforms. This was a period when it was performed, there was a Russian-French rapprochement after the Napoleonic invasion. And so the French element is there. And that second act, all of the sweets and all of that, was a kind of kids' version of the feast given to people, the Feast of the Peoples that was held after the coronation of czars. And so you'd have this, gingerbread and beer and sweets handed out to the public. So it had this kind of imperial dimension to it. And the ending of the original version, which Balanchine did remember very well, was the culmination of the ballet was up as a giant beehive on stage and honey, and it was Catherine the Great's vision of a harmonious society. That was the ending of this work. So it has this wonderful kind of, political imperial dimension that obviously was stripped away over time.